Hello everyone and welcome to the March tutorial for my YouTube channel. This month I am providing a tutorial over this trio of paper boats. It is inspired by Pablo Gomez's image from Pixabay, so please be sure to check him out. This lesson will be completed in 3 stages. I will complete the sketch, then the color blocking, and then move on to details and finish. The entire lesson takes about an hour and 20 minutes. To complete the lesson, I'm using an 8x10 inch canvas panel, Liquin original, and colors in Prussian Blue, Yellow Ochre, Cadmium Yellow, Cadmium Red, Mars Black, Titanium White, Burnt Sienna, and a variety of brushes. And please use the brushes that you have available. You just want a large, a medium, and a small brush. Stage 1 is beginning the sketch, and as usual I have toned the canvas with burnt sienna, and once I have toned I sketch in with charcoal or pencil, and I go back and I draw over it in a thinned out burnt sienna. So here is the sketch that you can screenshot if you would like to use it that way, or you can follow along. This is mostly straight lines. Do take your time when you're doing the sketch to try to get those lines as accurate as you can, but don't stress too much about it because this tutorial should be fun and should be a way for you to just have fun creating. I picked this particular tutorial because I thought it was interesting to have so many different colors with the shading and the straight lines, so it's a good practice in blending and color mixing as well. So just take your time with the sketch. Be sure that you create markers for yourself with all of these various lines. You can see that the boats are pretty much constructed the same way for each boat. So you'll have the kind of top folded inside, which opens up, the peak, and then the sides of the boat as well. And we will be notating the different areas of the boat with different shades of our colors, yellow, green, and blue. So this should hopefully be a fun sketch. You'll see that I did forget to add in the lines for this green boat, but it's very, very simple. You just kind of invert the point there and then create the 2 lines. If you find that when you do the underpainting or the sketches in burnt sienna, it tends to mix in with your colors, I actually like this effect because I feel it tones and it adds a bit of richness and depth to the colors. But you can actually create your sketch the day before or a few hours before and let the paints dry a little bit and then go in and paint over and fill in and build up your painting from there. That's perfectly acceptable. Sometimes when we're new to oil painting and we're kind of still learning what the colors and the process does, it can be a little frustrating when we're picking up those background colors. I actually, as I mentioned, I feel it gives a very kind of warm tone and feel to the canvas. So don't be afraid if these tutorials are going too fast, or if you ever feel that you're mixing mud on the canvas, to just take a step back, let your painting dry overnight or for a few days, and then come back to it later. I created this tutorial in very specific constraints with I wanted to be sure that I was only using a handful of colors and that I was completing the tutorial in about an hour and a half, a little under an hour and a half. So those are the constraints that I'm working with and why I have decided to work alla prima. But any of the tutorials that I have provided, you can break up into those 3 stages of sketch, blocking, and details, and allow the painting to dry and come back and work the painting again. Many artists do that when I'm working on more detailed pieces or longer pieces. You've probably seen on my YouTube shorts or in my process time-lapse videos that I also post. Those are usually done over somewhere between 16 and 20 hours. So take your time and just make sure that the process makes sense to you and that it is fun to you. As you're continuing, to block in, you can start to think about where you would like to put your lights and your darks, and you'll see that I will do that in just a little while. I always like to mark the darkest spot on the canvas and be sure that I leave the lightest spot on the canvas white. And if you have a mess up, or if you don't like the way a certain line looks, or if you've colored in the wrong section, don't stress. You can just take your shop towel and you can wipe that up, because this is very thinned out burnt sienna with the Gamasol, so it's very easily able to wipe off the canvas. So we'll just continue this sketch, and then once we have the sketch in, we'll move forward with the blocking stages. For stage 2, which is blocking, we will start to put down the basic colors to be included in the painting. And so I am starting with the background, and the background is going to be a mix of titanium white with a very, very small hint of blue. I actually started here with just a little bit of Mars black, but I found that it was too gray. With the Mars black, it tends towards the blue, and I wanted a bit more of that blue coming through. So you're going to see that I'll come back here in a few minutes and I'll start to mix a little bit of Prussian blue in. But what I'm trying to achieve at this stage is blocking in the background and trying to get the lightness of the background to come forward. I've mentioned in previous tutorials that part of my process is putting in the background first, and that's because the colors change and we interpret them differently depending on what is next to them on the canvas. So I have done pieces in the past where I've painted the closest objects or the main focal objects first, and then gone back in and painted the background and then had to go back and readjust. So for these alla prima tutorials, I find the best way to approach or to complete them is to get the background in, if not first, then at least after the color blocking stage, so that you can make adjustments as necessary. You'll notice that when you look at the original image from Pixabay, from Pablo, that the background is very light and it's a bit bluer on the left side than it is on the right side. And so as I am mixing and adding in the colors, I'm sure to add more blue in on that darker side and kind of gradiate that or shade that out. So at this point, I'm using a dagger brush, and I decided to use the dagger brush because it's just a little bit easier to get those nice, crisp, straight lines. You can also use a flat brush, which has the more rectangular edges, but really any brush will work here. I'm a fan of using a dagger brush for the background because it's nice to be able to change and rotate your hand and have brush strokes going in different directions. The brush holds a lot of paint for a dagger brush. So you can see that to complete this, I am just outlining those shapes. I'm not filling in the shadows at all yet. One way to approach this could be to put the background in and then fill the shadows in over that. But since I'm doing this in an alla prima fashion, which means all at once, I don't want to have the challenge of having the white underneath the shadows. If I were to let this dry between sessions, it would be much easier to kind of add the white in and then go back and paint the shadows. But since I'm doing this all in one session, it's just very difficult to cover up white because it starts to mix with the shadow color and it'll make it lighter and more chalky looking. So I've just decided to outline the shadows, leave those empty for now, and then once we get the boats blocked in and the details on the boats, come back and we will look at the shadows and work on those in a completely separate way. So it does sometimes take a little bit of time to fill in the backgrounds. I like to use the canvas boards for these quick tutorials because these tutorials are practice. It's a great way to learn about your process and to learn about colors. And also, if you mess up or if the painting goes wrong, it's much easier to throw away a canvas board than it is a complete nice canvas, which I always do use canvases for my more detailed paintings. So sometimes working the color into the canvas board can be a bit of a challenge, so just take your time and be sure to get the entire board colored. When you see that I'm taking the brush off camera, what I'm actually doing is dipping the brush into Liquin Original, which I get from Winsor & Newton, and the Liquin Original acts as a medium, and it will help to spread the paint, make the paint a little bit creamier, and it helps to make it a little bit more even in the application. Just be sure that if you're using the Liquin Original that you're only putting a very small drop, because it's easy to put too much in and that will change the texture of your paper at the end, at the painting at the end. Sometimes it gets a little bit too glossy. The paint can start to do really weird things, and how it stands up over time is different than if you're just using a little bit of the medium. You can also use Liquin. I'm sorry, you can also use linseed oil, and that's something that is a favorite of many painters, especially if you're going to be painting over several sessions and you want your paint to stay wet longer. Liquin is nice because it does speed up the drying process a little bit. So if I were to put the background in using a little bit of Liquin on one day, by the next day, the background would be dry and I could come back in and layer over that. So that might be something that you want to experiment with in the future as you learn more about your approach and about your process to painting using Liquin versus linseed oil, and just kind of decide which you like better and which works better for your own personal process. You can also thin the paints out with Gamsol. It does make them runnier, and that is good for when we're doing things like the sketches or when we go back and we add those final highlights in. It helps to make the paint more like an ink, as Bob Ross would say, and helps to kind of get those really fine highlights in. You just want to be careful because the painting should get more fat content or more thickness as you build up the different layers. So you can see I'm starting to add in just that little tiny hint of Prussian blue on the one side, and I will eventually kind of fade that out so that it's brighter on one side and just a tad bit darker on the other. When I move on to mixing the shadows, I will be using blues and cadmium red as well, and that will help to deepen the shadows a little bit into a nice purple. As we move forward, we won't be using any black in the shadows for this painting. So putting a little bit of the blue in the background is also really nice because it starts to tie in together the different elements of the painting. So I will continue to put in this background, and then once that is finished, we will start with the big paper boat and mixing and blocking in those shades. Feel free to slow this down, to pause, to take your time as you move through the tutorial. You do not have to keep up with me. The first time I followed a tutorial, I think I took 3 times longer than the instructor did, and that's fine because it's all about you. It's all about your learning process and really getting in there and experimenting with the paints, learning how the paints work and learning the feel that you like with the paints. And I know that sounds a little bit funny, but learning how you like to manipulate paint and how you like to lay paint down is going to make the process more enjoyable for you, so that you will want to paint more often and so that your painting sessions will be more successful. As you can see, I blended out the background just to soften the edges with the blending brush, and that is very helpful when moving between stages until you get to the detail stage. Now I'm going to start working on that first big boat, and so I am putting down Cadmium Yellow, Mars Black, Prussian Blue, and Cadmium Red. And what I would like to try to do is to darken the paint for the darkest shadows, and do that using as little black as possible. So I mostly use Prussian Blue, and first I'm mixing a bit of a dark orange with the red and the yellow, and that dark orange will bring a bit of richness to that dark color and to that shadow. And then I add a small amount of the Mars Black, but I immediately see that because this mix is tending more towards the yellow than the red, that it's starting to turn the paint green. And so I went ahead and I left this in here because I wanted to show that when you make a mistake, it's okay. You don't have to completely throw the painting out. You don't have to throw the painting over. It's just you want to make a note when something's not working and then stop and kind of try to figure out what's going on. So I figured out, okay, the combination was too yellow, there wasn't enough red, and that was immediately turning it green. So what I'm doing is I'm going back and I'm going to cover this over with a little bit of that orange to take out that green tint, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to add in blue and start working with a darker yellow ochre instead to help bring more depth and more richness. So don't be afraid to pull in other colors if you see that something's not working. That's completely fine. I would caution you against using too many pre-mixed colors in your palette, because we do want to learn how to mix these colors ourselves and how to play with the colors, and working from a limited palette is the best way to do that. So I did want to be sure to point out that even someone who works with paint and paints often, we still sometimes make little mistakes as we're experimenting, or maybe not even a mistake. It just didn't work out the way that I had hoped it would. So bringing in that yellow ochre is getting that depth and that richness that I wanted from the get-go, and the cadmium yellow is going to help me to bring in those areas of light and highlights. So I'm going ahead and I'm going back over with the yellow ochre. And what I'm really thinking about as I'm starting to put in these colors are, where are my areas of dark and where are my areas of light? So you want to start painting in your dark colors first, and to just kind of establish those dark areas so that you can build up to the light areas. And if you look at the original image, we can tell where the light source is from how the shadows are cast. So the bottom part of the boat, towards where the painting tends to more blue, is going to be the darkest part, and the top parts of the boat are going to be the lightest part. But we also have to take into account that there are shadows within the folds in the top of the boat, and that'll become more clear as I continue to kind of paint. So I'm painting this shadowed side here, and then you can see where on the underpainting I have filled in where the darkest side is going to be, and I will move forward with attempting that in just a second. But first, establishing the darks and then moving towards the lights is a really great approach. We always want to be sure to have a dark, a mid-tone, and a light, but I recommend that you have 5 transitions for every area. This is just one way to get more variation and more color depth, and one way that I have found I can achieve this is by mixing the paint on the palette and mixing paint as I go. This is something that I've mentioned in previous tutorials. Some artists like to mix up all of their paint and all of their colors before they start, so they have a clear plan for moving forward. I find that mixing the paint on the palette is enjoyable, and it also helps me to have more color variation because I'm continuously adding in, taking out. Normally, when we want to lighten a color, we don't want to add white because white will make the color more chalky and a little bit duller. I did decide to use white on this painting for a couple of reasons. One of the first reasons is that the painting itself tends towards the kind of light, duller pastel colors. So adding a small amount of white helped me to achieve a color that was closer to what is represented in the photo. So I'm experimenting here with how much white that needs to be and starting to move in to those lighter areas. So here at the bottom of the folds for the inside of the boat, I guess we could call this the cabin of the paper boat, where the light is hitting the folds or the creases because they are higher than the areas of shadow. And then on this side, which would have more light, we can see that the shadow is directly on the other side of the boat. So we would have more light on this side than with the other side. And this doesn't have to be perfect at this point. We're really just kind of laying the colors down, seeing how the colors work together and adjusting as they go. So I really don't want to go too much lighter than this until I get to the highlights, because I don't want to completely dull out the richness of the yellow. But I did make the choice to use white in this painting, which is not something that I would normally do unless I was intentionally trying to mix duller or grayer colors. One thing you want to notice when you're painting these paper boats is that on the inside of the boat there are folds where we have little flaps of paper. And so we want to be sure that we are adding a little bit of depth there so we can see where the paper is folded over. I'm going ahead and I'm establishing some of those lighter highlights. I'm going to come back and I'm going to go over these several times actually, but I'm doing this for a few reasons. The first is I want to go ahead and start to get that lighter color in so I can see what it's going to look like and go back and adjust my shadows. The second is it's helping me to start to blend out some of my sketch lines from the burnt sienna. With the yellow, these were just a little bit more challenging to cover over. So I'll continue to work on the areas of light and the areas of dark on this boat, and you can follow along. And of course, you can watch my approach, but if you're able to also get a copy of the reference image and look at this as you move forward too, you can start to think about, okay, well, if I were doing this completely on my own, what are some of the choices that I would make where the lights and the shadows go? Because one of the really interesting things about art and about doing reference photos and things like this is we make different choices as artists, and we start to kind of see things in our own way. So maybe you would want a lighter color, or maybe you would want your colors to be a little bit darker. You can start to see where I add in shadows and how those shadows correlate to what I'm seeing, and maybe you see more shadow or maybe you'd like less shadow. So don't be afraid to follow along, but also pull up that reference image and look at that reference image as you move forward as well. It can be really challenging to work from a reference image, but it's also really fun to kind of see the changes that we make as we move forward, and how certain elements and certain circumstances arise as we're painting that we kind of have to adjust and move forward with. And that's where you're going to really get a lot of experience. So here I've mixed some yellow ochre, and I choose the yellow ochre, and then I've mixed it with a little bit of red and blue that I have mixed to give it kind of an almost a orange, like a dark kind of burnt orange, light brown color. And the reason that I have done this is because I want to have the darkest area on this side of the boat. And then now that I've established this brown color, I can lighten it up a little bit and go in and start to pull in more of those shadow areas again with this darkest color that I'm using. I bringing that blending brush back in at this stage and just kind of dulling down some of those lines. You can see that I went a little bit out of the line where I wanted to, and this is something that I'm going to kind of come back to several times over the painting as I blend that in and cover that over with the background again. But bringing out the blending brush is just a great way to make sure that you don't have any of those hard edges in your painting as well. And don't be afraid if you make mistakes like this. It's perfectly fixable, especially when you are doing something for practice. So oil is very forgiving, and as I mentioned, you can always come back the next day if you start to kind of mix mud, or if you feel like you've gone to a point where you can't fix it. Just wait for it to dry and come back. But you're going to see that I'm going to leave that for a little while, and then once I've filled in more of the painting, I'll see how much that mistake still bothers me, and then I'll move forward with correcting that mistake. Sometimes when we're painting, we get so focused on having every little element and every little bit of the painting look perfect that we forget to give ourselves grace, and sometimes we're even thinking too deeply about some of these elements because sometimes they're not as important in the overall composition. So you can see that I will come back and continue to kind of play with this and mess with this as I move forward. I'm just continuing to add these lines of depth, especially along the folds. In the top here, I've added a kind of a line of bright orange to show where the light is coming through the top of the cabin. But I just want to kind of establish those fold lines and start to bring out the structure of the boat a bit more as I move forward. Now that I have finished the yellow boat, I am moving forward with starting to paint the middle boat, which is our green boat. And for this boat, I am mixing the Prussian Blue with the existing piles of yellow that I have on my palette. So just like with the previous boat, I'm going to start to first think about the areas of dark, and I want to have my darkest, richest green. So I've got a lot of yellow ochre, some Prussian blue to start to get this base color. And the yellow ochre has that more kind of brownish tone to it, so I'm using that to mix in, and you can even put a small bit of red in there as well. And following the kind of map that I've made for myself with the first boat, I'm going in and first starting with those darkest areas, which is this kind of panel on the side here, furthest away from the light, and I fill that in and then start to think about where the other shadows on the boat are. And with this second boat, it goes a little bit faster, well, because it's smaller, and also because in my practice with the yellow boat, I've already kind of figured out where the folds should be, where the areas of dark and light should be, and it just makes it a little bit easier to go in and to establish those colors. Again, we want to be sure that we have a dark, a mid-tone, or kind of a middle color, and the light color as well. So thinking about where the shadows are falling, thinking about where the folds are. When I'm making the folds, you want to have that dark line with a lighter line on top of it to show where the fold is higher to the light. And once I've established these darks, I can go in and start blending the midtones. I was really pleased with how this green came out. It was just a really rich, pretty color of green. And this is one of the areas where I mentioned having the reference photo and looking at the reference photo for yourself, because this green is a little bit deeper than what is on the photo, but I just found it very pleasing. So I decided I wanted to go forward and have this darker green because I just really loved it in the composition. So you're going to find as you evolve and as you learn more about yourself and who you are as an artist, there are certain colors that you like and certain colors that just work really well for you. So if you've made a color that you are really enjoying, even if it's not an exact match for the photo, this is where you could take, I guess we could call it artistic license, and go in and make those small changes, because ultimately at the end of the day, this is your painting and this is your experience, and you want to make it something that is going to make you happy and is going to be something that you enjoy. And the process, the enjoyment of the process is sometimes worth more, most often is going to be worth more than the finished product, especially as you're starting out and especially as you're learning. I did want to be very, very careful when adding in this green line because it is so close to the yellow boat. So it's easy to start to kind of mix the colors together and to mix mud here. So this is why I'm using the flat brush, which allows me a little bit more precision with making a line. I would have liked to have had smaller lines, but I decided against using detail brushes in this tutorial because I wanted to make sure that this tutorial was something that could be followed along at home for somebody who was just starting out, not having all of the different types of brushes and tools and paints and such. So this is why I have limited myself to a specific amount of time, a specific palette, and as few brushes as I could use. So if you have more tools and you want to use different brushes, or if you want to use smaller brushes once you start to get into the details, please do so. I'm just limiting because I'm thinking about the kinds of tools that I had in my studio when I first started out, and kind of just learning without having to invest tons and tons of money. I do use Rosemary & Co. brushes now. I have found that the Rosemary & Co. brushes are just really nice. They're high quality. I have some that I've had for a little over 2 years that are still performing very well. As long as you clean your brushes and you take care of them, if you get the higher quality brushes, they will last and they will reward you. So just kind of keep that in mind as you continue to progress in your skill, as you continue to kind of devote time to painting and you decide if this is something that you want to spend time doing. Investing in specific tools can be really helpful. And so even if you only have a handful of brushes or a set of very basic brushes, even investing in those higher quality brushes can be really great. So Rosemary & Co. is what I am currently using and what I am recommending as well. If you decide that you do not want to paint on the canvas board but would rather be painting on a canvas, I also recommend Sunbelt canvases, and these canvases were recommended by Kevin Hill. I was a member of his Patreon group, which is really excellent, for a while, and he let me know about those, and they are excellent, excellent canvases. So I want to pass that recommendation on to you as well. And if you have any tools or any specific products that work well for you that you would like to recommend, please feel free to put them in the comments below. I very much believe that creative processes, we should not be gatekeepers, and we should share the information that we can to help each other. And doing so makes painting more collaborative. So now that I've added in my lights, I am going back in and I'm thinking about those areas of shadow, and I will blend those areas of shadow back in. And this is where you can really see what I mean when I say mixing on the palette. So I've kind of used most of my dark, so I'm going back in and I'm kind of creating that dark again, and it just gives a bit more richness because the color is slightly different, which it is when you look at the boats and you look at the different shadows and how the light hits something, where the shadow hits something. That all changes how we understand the shadows, how close it is to the yellow versus how close it is to the blue or the white of the background. And you can see I'm trying to go in and highlight here to add in these areas where you can see the folds in the paper. And that was just a detail that I really, really enjoyed from these boats. Once I have the shadows established the way that I like, I can go back in and think again about where those areas of light would hit, and I will address those as well. But I want to be sure that I'm getting the depth in the boat with the shadows. If you are able to have 2 of each brush, this can also be really helpful when you start to work and you need to move back and forth between lights and darks. There are many artists who will have 1 brush for lights and 1 brush for darks so that they don't have to continuously clean them out. You can also just kind of wipe your brush out on a shop towel or on a rag, and that can help as well. That's completely up to you and to your process. I tend to just wipe out. I'm showing you here that I'm using a small round brush and just kind of flattening it against the palette to try to get the best line I can. And you can see here that the lines aren't completely straight, and that's okay, because for this alla prima piece, what I'm really looking for is the charm and the whimsy of these boats. And I think that you'll see in the final piece that all comes together. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to add in these areas of white, these white lines, and then once I have established the lights and the darks as I like, we'll move on to the blue boat. For the areas of blue, I wanted to be a little bit more careful because I'm going to bring with my palette because I'm going to bring the blues into the areas of shadow as well. So I'm thinking about, as I'm mixing these blues, how I'm also going to need to have blues for the shadows. To establish the dark, I've mixed Prussian Blue with Cadmium Red, and this makes what's really a dark purple. And the dark purple, you have to be careful because it can overwhelm. Prussian Blue is a paint color that will take over everything. So you want to be really careful and put it where it needs to be, knowing that you can blend it to shade with the midtones and the lights that go next to it. So be a bit sparing with this dark blue color. As with the green and the yellow, I also decided to go ahead and bring in the titanium white, and so I'm just kind of mixing that mid-tone here to establish the differences in shading for the boat. So thinking about the inside, thinking about the outsides and where these midtones would need to go. And now that this is our third boat, we have a pretty good idea of where those shadows should rest. Just continue to think about what's the deepest part of the painting, what part of this object is farthest away from the light, and what part of the object is closest to the light. What's farthest away from the light is going to be the darkest, and what is closest to the light is going to be the brightest. If you follow that and you think about that, you could even make a paper boat and take it next to your light bulb and manipulate it, move it around. Look at how the shadows change depending on the angle and how close it is to the light bulb. That can be really helpful to manipulate objects. If you all are interested, I could do a tutorial which we paint from a still life. I've been using these images so far for these tutorials because the images are something that are free and they're accessible for everyone. And I want to be sure that everyone who wants to is able to participate in the tutorial, and that sometimes with a still life you need more objects, but I could always do one of those and take some images to share with you as well. So here I am adding in that area of light on this side and just continuing to think about where those folds and those creases would be so that I can have the appearance of the lines in the paper as they are. I also want to think about how the light is hitting the top portion of the boat, especially this small one. It's not really in the shadow of the green boat, as the green boat was in the shadow of the yellow boat. Also thinking about where those little small folds of paper would be on the inside of the chamber of the boat. So add in your darks first, then go to your midtones and then your lights, and then you can blend out and blend together and adjust as needed. Working from dark to light is a really great way to approach it. I first started out with watercolor, and watercolor is a little bit different. You start with the lightest area and you leave those lights in the paper, and then you move up to the darks. So when I first started oil painting, it was kind of hard for me to wrap my head around going in the other order. But as I mentioned, one of the great things about oil paint is that you can come in and you can add more, and you can always wait for it to dry and add more as well. So I'm just coming in and establishing a little bit more of that light and thinking about how I can build up the form by blending into the darks and blending into the lights. Now that I have completed the third boat, I'm going to start to think about the shadows and where the shadows are going to fall. And with this a particular image, and this is one of the reasons why I selected this image, it's a little bit trickier because we actually have several cast shadows for each boat, and that has to do with the light source and where the light is coming from. So we have the darkest shadow, which is the shadow that is cast by the object that dark shadow is under. So we have the darkest blue coming in under the blue boat, and this is just the Prussian blue and the red, making that really kind of nice dark blue towards the purple. And then we also have the cast shadow of the green boat in this same color, and this is I guess we would call it the primary shadow for the boat. But then we're going to come back in and we're going to have a mid-tone or a middle color shadow where two shadows are overlapping. And we will also have shadows where it's just the shadow of the singular boat that's next to it. This sounds a little bit complicated, but I think it'll make sense as we continue to add in these shadows. And the further the object is away from where the shadow is cast, the lighter the shadow is going to be. So I am approaching these shadows in the same way I have with painting the boats. I'm starting with the darkest shadow, and then once I have established those darkest shadows, I will move into painting the middle shadow, and then I will finally end with the lightest shadow and blend a little bit together, just ever so slightly, so that we don't have super sharp lines. And this is something that you can think about when you look at the reference image. I found the fuzzier lines a bit more appealing than I did the sharp shadows. Of course, the closer it is to the light source, the harder or harsher the line of the shadow would be, but this is just kind of aesthetically what you enjoy and what you would like to see in your own painting. So I'm continuing to kind of go in here and just very, very carefully using the flat brush, adding in those shadows. You'll notice that I did leave a bit of a line here for this kind of golden orange light to come through. This boat wasn't exactly flush on the table, so there was that kind of little peep of light through the bottom where I guess the paper is a little bit thinner, and I really liked that effect, so I left it in. To mix the shadows with the blue, I'm going ahead and adding white, and this is just kind of echoing the colors that we've used in the painting so far and echoing the colors of the background. And just fill these shapes in. Sometimes it's easier when you're painting to think about the individual shapes and less about the whole painting and how it's coming together. We're always going to come back. We're always going to look at the whole painting. But when you're painting something that's kind of complex and you're kind of trying to think, okay, well, why is this or why is it looking like that? We can trick ourselves or we can trick our eyes. But if we think about these just as shapes, and if we fill them in according to the sketch that we've created, according to the guidelines that we've created, it makes it easier to be sure that we get the colors and the tones in the right place. And you'll see that once those midtones go in, it very quickly starts to look like shadow, and it very quickly brings up the level of the painting because we're starting to see the objects come together. We're starting to see the painting come together, and this is where it gets really exciting. So we'll continue to work on those midtones, and then once we've got the midtones in, we will work on the lightest shadows by just continuing to add in the white. Add it in sparingly at first. You can always add more white, but you can't take the white out, especially with the titanium white. It can overpower in the same way that the Prussian blue can, so just take your time. You can also add a little bit of red here if you want it to have more of a purple tone than a blue tone. I just really liked the kind of complementary colors and how they were working together. So I chose these colors that were most pleasing to me. It's a little bit brighter than the reference image, but I really liked the way that it worked. Now that I've established the midtones, I'm going to go in and start to put the very lightest shadows, and these are almost a hint of shadow, and we can kind of go back to the boats, look at the boats, and decide which element is casting which shadow, but these are going to be the lightest, and these are going to be the shadows that we will blend out to the greatest extent when we have finished establishing the shadows. So just go very slowly and put in these areas. You're going to notice that the area that's left open on this side of the boat is actually going to be the lightest shadow in the entire painting, and it's also basically the same color as the blue that's on the other side of the painting. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is where painting that background in and kind of thinking about color theory becomes really helpful, because we don't want to make this too dark. It's almost just like a hint or a whisper or a kiss of the shadow, and so just very carefully putting it in here, knowing that I'm going to blend out those edges, but I also want to try to cover up as much of the bare canvas as I can that is left. It can be difficult sometimes when we have so many lines that we want to keep sharp and crisp, but don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of messing up. Just kind of go in and try to cover up these lines as much as you can. Now I am taking out my blending brush and I am just kind of blending those shadows together, making sure that I've covered up all of the areas of the canvas, making sure that none of those lines are too harsh. And if I find that I overblend, I can always come back and add a crisper line in at the end. This is also where I've decided to come back and try to adjust that earlier blending that I did of the yellow in, and just adding a bit more blue just completely takes that away. And so putting that off and dealing with it towards the end of the painting was really helpful to me, because I wasn't obsessing or focusing too much on it as I went forward. Sometimes I will keep a piece of paper or a small notebook by my side when I'm painting, especially when I'm doing a painting that takes place over several different sessions, and I'll make a note of things that I want to remember to go back and look at again, or things that I want to change. When I'm working on a painting over several sessions and I'm letting it dry, I'll come back and look at it and I'll say, oh, the nose is a little crooked, or I need to put more shading in on the lips, and I'll write these kinds of lists so that the next time I come back to sit down for a session and I'm got all my paints out, my mind doesn't completely go blank. I can kind of have a point to start the next session. So there is no shame in making notes for yourself. These paintings can become very complex. There are a lot of moving pieces, and as we move from one point of the painting to the other, it can become easy to forget things that we want to come back and look at again. So just make notes for yourself. I am going ahead and I'm putting in the final highlights for the painting as this last bit, and you can see that I immediately put down way too much white. It had a big blob of white, and so I just wiped it away. I blended it out, and then I'll go back in and I'll reestablish that line. So I've left these things in this tutorial because I want you to see that we can work around them. No mistake is going to ruin your painting. You just kind of readjust and move forward. To thin out this highlight, I have placed my brush in Liquin, and I'm not overworking it. I'm just kind of putting the brush down and I'm making the line until I run out of paint, and then starting again. And again, it provides that kind of charming, whimsical, painterly look. And I'm happy with that, and I'm happy with the way that it turns out. I just want to really kind of think about those areas of highlight where the light will be hitting, where it catches the eye when we're looking at that original reference, and add those in to give the boats the dimension and to show that bit of light. So on the tops of folds, on the very tops of the object itself, and anywhere where the paper is most closely folded to the light. So I'll add in these final highlights and then give the painting a final blending, and it will be complete and ready to share. After I have adjusted and added in those final highlights, one last thing that I want to start to think about, and this is something that you will want to pay attention to as you move forward with your paintings and as you start painting from references yourself, and that is reflected light. The reflected light is the colors from the other objects that bounce into the object that you're painting. So because the yellow boat and the green boat are so close together, we want to be sure that we're adding just a little bit of green into the reflected light on the yellow boat. And so we want to think about where that light is going to end up and be sure to add it in. And so since this boat is yellow, I am going to add in just the smallest hint of green, and this small hint of green just helps to pull this together, the painting together. So I'm adding in the green here just to show where it would be reflecting, and then I will add a bit of blue into the green boat. And now our painting is finished. We have added in all of the layers. We have made sure that our colors are balanced, and the painting is ready to share. Of course, you can always come back in. I wanted to compare it to the original image to see how close we got, and I think we got a pretty good, pretty interesting representation here. So thank you for following along. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to help me get more viewers on the channel. And if you have any ideas for future tutorials, please share them in the comment below, and I'll consider them for our April tutorial next week. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.